My name is William Stanton. I am 70 years old. For 40 years, I worked as a structural engineer in Chicago, calculating load-bearing walls and testing stress points to ensure the foundations I built would hold steady. I applied that exact same logic to my family. I spent my adult life making sure my wife Diane and our son Matthew had a rock-solid foundation. I thought the quiet life we built was impenetrable. But I was wrong. A foundation is only as strong as its materials, and I had no idea the people I loved most were rotting from the inside out. If you have ever felt that sickening drop in your stomach when someone you trust shows you their true face, hit the like button. Subscribe to the channel so you do not miss my next stories, and tell me in the comments where you are listening from today. It brings this old man comfort to know I am not speaking into the void. This nightmare started on a freezing Tuesday in November. It was the day we buried Diane. She was 68. We had been married for 45 years. She was a brilliant woman, a senior executive assistant handling highly classified accounts for Vincent Caldwell, the billionaire founder of Caldwell Investments. Diane managed high-pressure corporate situations with absolute grace and kept our family anchored. 2 days earlier, she collapsed on our kitchen floor. The paramedics called it a massive sudden heart attack. 1 minute she was pouring coffee and the next my entire world shattered. The grief was a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I was operating on pure autopilot, moving through the funeral preparations like a ghost. I was standing in the hallway of our home wearing a stiff black suit, waiting for the funeral cars to arrive. The house was painfully quiet. That was when my cell phone vibrated in my pocket. I did not recognize the private number, but I answered it anyway. It was Vincent Caldwell. He did not offer condolences. He did not speak in the soft, pitying tones everyone else used. His voice was sharp, urgent, and laced with pure fear. "William," he said, his breath hitching, "I am sorry to call you today of all days, but I found something in Diane's secure files. You need to come to my office right now." I leaned against the hallway wall, rubbing my tired eyes. "Vincent," I whispered, "we are burying her in an hour. I cannot leave." "I know," he interrupted, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper, "but this cannot wait. Something terrible has happened." And William listened to me very carefully. "Do not tell your son where you are going. Do not tell your daughter-in-law. You could be in danger. Just get through the service and come straight here." Before I could ask what he meant, he hung up. The line went dead. My hands started to shake. Danger. Why would I be in danger? And why would Vincent warn me against my own son? I stared at the blank screen of my phone, a deep dread pooling in my stomach. The structural integrity of my life had just cracked. I put the phone back in my pocket and walked out to face the funeral, carrying a secret that was about to blow my family wide open. The cold wind hit my face as I stepped onto the porch, but it was nothing compared to the chill spreading through my veins. I climbed into the back of the black town car, staring blindly at the rain hitting the tinted windows, bracing myself for the hardest day of my life. The rain in Chicago that afternoon felt like ice slicing through my skin. It was one of those bleak, gray November days where the sky hangs so low, it feels like it might crush you. The cemetery was a sea of black umbrellas dotting the vibrant green grass around the open grave. The priest was reading from a small leather-bound book, his voice a steady, monotonous drone that barely registered over the sound of the freezing rain hitting the canopy above us. I stood at the very edge of the plot, staring down at the polished mahogany casket, holding my wife of 45 years. My body felt numb. I was frozen in place, feeling every one of my 70 years weighing down on my tired shoulders. But my mind was not on the priest's words. My mind was racing, replaying Vincent Caldwell's chilling warning over and over again. "You could be in danger. Do not tell your son." I slowly shifted my gaze away from the casket and looked across the open grave at Matthew. My 35-year-old son stood there in his immaculate, custom-tailored charcoal suit. Matthew was a senior financial planner. He made a lucrative living advising wealthy clients on how to grow and protect their assets. He was polished, articulate, and always projecting an image of absolute control. Next to him stood Sarah, my 33-year-old daughter-in-law. She owned a high-end fashion boutique downtown, a vanity project that perpetually bled cash but kept her in the right social circles. She was dressed in a sleek designer black dress that looked more appropriate for a fashion gala than a muddy cemetery. Under normal circumstances, I would look at them and see my family, my support system, the people who were supposed to hold me up in my darkest hour. But Vincent's words had planted a toxic seed of doubt in my mind. So I watched them. I watched them closely. And what I saw sent a cold spike of paranoia straight through my spine. They were not crying. Not a single tear fell from their eyes. Matthew's face was completely stoic, almost bored. His jaw was set, and his eyes kept darting around the crowd, assessing the guests, sizing up the wealthy clients and firm partners who had come to pay their respects to Diane. He was networking at his mother's funeral. Sarah was worse. She was holding an elegant black umbrella over them, leaning close to Matthew. I watched her lips moving in rapid, frantic whispers. She nudged his elbow. Her eyes narrowed in a fierce, urgent intensity. Matthew frowned, whispering back without looking at her, his expression tight with irritation. This was not the body language of a grieving son and a supportive wife. This was the body language of two people arguing over a deadline. Two people who were incredibly anxious about something completely unrelated to the woman being lowered into the earth. My gut clenched. A structural engineer learns early on to look for the tiny fractures, the hairline cracks in a concrete pillar that tell you the whole building is about to come down. Matthew and Sarah were covered in cracks. I tried to focus back on the service to give Diane the respect and attention she deserved in her final moments above ground. But my eyes were drawn back to Sarah. She had stopped whispering to Matthew and was now staring directly at me. No, she was not staring at my face. She was staring at my chest. Specifically, she was locked onto the inner breast pocket of my heavy wool winter coat. My heart skipped a heavy beat. I knew exactly what was in that pocket. When the paramedics took Diane away, I had found her key ring sitting on her nightstand. Diane was a meticulous woman. She managed sensitive, highly classified financial records for Caldwell Investments. She kept a small fireproof biometric safe hidden in the back of her home office closet. It held emergency cash, critical legal documents, and a black leather ledger she used to track offline accounts for Vincent. She always told me that if anything ever happened to her, I needed to secure that safe immediately. I had taken her primary keys, the ones that included the small, heavy brass key to the safe's manual override, and slipped them deep into my inner coat pocket. Sarah's gaze was completely fixated on that exact spot. I could see the raw, hungry calculation in her eyes. She leaned into Matthew again, giving a sharp, almost imperceptible nod in my direction. Matthew followed her gaze, his eyes landing on my coat. For a fraction of a second, his polished mask slipped. I saw a flash of raw, desperate greed. It was a look I had never seen on my son's face before, and it terrified me. The priest finished his prayer and closed his book. People began to step forward, tossing single white roses onto the casket. The rhythmic thud of the flowers hitting the wood echoed in the quiet cemetery. Matthew and Sarah walked over to me. The transition was instant and seamless. Sarah's face contorted into a mask of profound sorrow. She threw her free arm around my shoulders, pressing her wet cheek against mine. "Oh, William," she sobbed, her voice loud enough for the surrounding guests to hear. "I am so incredibly sorry. We are going to get through this together. We are here for you." Her performance was flawless. If I had not been watching her a moment before, if Vincent had not warned me, I would have fallen right into her arms. But as she hugged me, I felt her hand slide down my back. I felt her fingers casually, deliberately brush against the outside of my coat, right over the inner pocket where the keys rested. She was checking to see if they were there. I stiffened, fighting the urge to shove her away. I forced myself to pat her back. "Thank you, Sarah." I rasped, my voice sounding hollow and old. Matthew stepped up next, placing a firm, heavy hand on my shoulder. He looked me straight in the eye, perfectly mirroring my grief. "Dad," he said, his voice thick with practiced emotion. "You are not alone. We are going home and Sarah and I are going to take care of everything. Do not worry about a single detail today. We have it all under control." I looked into the eyes of the boy I had raised, the man I had paid to put through business school, the son I had loved unconditionally. I saw nothing but a stranger who was entirely too eager to take control of my house and my wife's belongings. "I am just so tired, Matthew," I said, playing the part of the broken, exhausted widower. "I think I just want to go home and lie down." "Perfect," he replied smoothly. "We will drive you. You should not be behind the wheel right now. Let us handle the house." I nodded, letting my shoulders slump. I turned and walked toward the waiting black town car, the freezing rain soaking through my hair. The drive back to the house was suffocating. The silence in the car was thick, heavy with unspoken agendas. Every time I looked in the rearview mirror, I caught Sarah texting frantically on her phone. Matthew kept his eyes locked on the road, his grip on the steering wheel tight, his knuckles strained. The heater in the car was blasting, but I felt freezing cold. As we pulled into the driveway of the colonial house Diane and I had shared for 3 decades, a fresh wave of grief threatened to pull me under. This was our sanctuary. This was where we had hosted Thanksgiving dinners, where we had decorated countless Christmas trees, where we had lived a life I thought was built on truth and love. Now, looking at the dark windows, it felt like a crime scene waiting to happen. Matthew killed the engine. The sudden silence was deafening. "Dad," he said, turning around in his seat to face me, his voice adopting that sickeningly gentle tone again. "You go straight upstairs and rest. Sarah will make you some tea. I am going to head to Mom's office to start sorting out the immediate paperwork. We need to handle the funeral home invoice before they close today." The lie was so smooth, so perfectly delivered, that it chilled my blood. He was not waiting a single minute. He wanted into that office the second we crossed the threshold. "Okay, son," I mumbled, keeping my eyes downcast, playing the part he expected me to play. "Thank you." I stepped out into the freezing rain, my hand brushing against my chest, feeling the hard outline of the keys in my pocket. The battle had officially begun. I spent my entire life building a foundation of trust, believing that blood meant absolute loyalty. But true evil does not always break through your front door with a weapon. Sometimes it sits right at your dinner table, smiling, waiting for you to close your eyes. I lost the woman I loved to the boy we raised, but I refused to let her memory be buried in their lies. Greed is a poison that rots the human soul from the inside out. Always trust your instincts, because the most dangerous predators convince you that you are entirely safe. If this story opened your eyes, hit the like button and subscribe so you never miss another truth. Have you ever discovered a dark secret hidden by someone you loved and trusted? I am reading all your comments below. Share your story and let us expose the truth together. The ride back from the cemetery felt like a procession of ghosts. The rain lashed against the car windows, but the chill inside was worse. Matthew and Sarah sat across from me, their silence heavy with anticipation. When the tires crunched against our gravel driveway, Matthew unbuckled his seatbelt. He stepped into the freezing downpour and jogged toward the front porch, leaving me behind. Sarah followed, her heels clicking sharply against the wet stone. I trailed them, leaning on my cane, playing the widower. Inside the house was dark, cold, and suffocating. Diane's lavender perfume still lingered in the foyer, a painful reminder of the life ripped away from me 48 hours ago. Matthew kept his wet coat on. He turned to me, his face a mask of concern. "Dad, you need to lie down," he said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "It has been an exhausting day. Sarah will brew you tea in the kitchen. I will head upstairs and organize Mom's desk. The probate lawyers need her files, and we should not delay." He did not wait for my answer. He took the stairs 2 steps at a time, disappearing into the shadows of the second floor. Sarah gave me a tight smile and vanished into the kitchen. Running water masked the silence. I stood in the hallway, my heart hammering. Diane's home office was strictly off-limits to everyone in the family. She handled classified portfolios for Caldwell Investments, guarding that room like a fortress. She kept the door locked at all times. Matthew knew this. Everyone knew this. I gripped my cane, my knuckles turning white. Something was terribly wrong. I did not go to my bedroom. I moved silently up the stairs, placing each foot carefully on the edges to avoid the creaks of the old wood. When I reached the second-floor landing, the door to Diane's office was wide open. The heavy brass lock had been bypassed, the wood around the strike plate splintered. I pressed myself against the corridor wall, holding my breath, peering around the doorframe. What I saw made my blood run cold. The room was completely desecrated, treated like an abandoned warehouse. Diane was a woman of immaculate order. Her desk was always clear, her files meticulously labeled and locked away. Now drawers were pulled out and thrown onto the hardwood floor. Confidential banking statements, tax returns, and client portfolios were scattered everywhere like trash. Standing dead in the center of the chaos was my only son. Matthew was frantically tearing through a stack of manila folders, his eyes wild, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. He threw the empty folders over his shoulder, muttering vicious curses under his breath. He moved to the tall mahogany bookshelf, pulling out thick binders, shaking them to see if anything would fall out. He was not looking for probate documents. He was ruthlessly hunting for something specific, something extremely valuable and deeply hidden. He dropped to his knees, running his hands under the bottom rim of the desk, searching for a hidden compartment. He looked incredibly desperate, almost manic in his destructive pursuit. I watched the boy I had raised, the son I had paid to put through business school, violate his mother's sanctuary before her body was even cold in the ground. The betrayal tasted like ash in my mouth. I gripped the handle of my cane tightly, preparing to step into the ruined room and demand an explanation. I was ready to unleash the full force of a father's wrath. I wanted to grab him by his expensive suit and throw him out of my house. I took a deep breath, stepping out of the shadows. But before my foot could cross the threshold, a sharp vibration erupted against my chest. My cell phone started buzzing violently inside my inner coat pocket, resting dangerously close to Diane's safe keys. The sound seemed deafening in the quiet hallway. Matthew froze in place. He stopped tearing through the scattered papers and slowly turned his head toward the open door, his dark eyes narrowing with intense suspicion. I immediately shrank back into the darkness of the hallway, retreating quickly toward my bedroom. I slipped inside, closing the door soundlessly behind me, and pulled the phone from my pocket. The caller ID displayed a private number. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the device. I pressed the answer button and brought the cold device to my ear, forcing myself into keeping my breathing as shallow as humanly possible. "Hello," I whispered. "William," a voice said. It was sharp, authoritative, and laced with an unmistakable undercurrent of fear. It was Vincent Caldwell, Diane's billionaire boss, the man she had dedicated 20 years of her career to. Vincent. I breathed, confused and disoriented. "We just got back from the cemetery. I cannot talk about work right now." "I am not calling about work." William Vincent interrupted, his voice dropping to a harsh, urgent whisper. "I am calling because I found something. I was reviewing Diane's secure digital footprint an hour ago. Something terrible has happened. You need to come to my office right now." I sat on the edge of my bed, the room spinning slightly. "Vincent. What are you talking about?" "What did you find?" "Listen to me very carefully," Vincent said, spacing out every single word. "Do not tell your son where you are going. Do not tell your daughter-in-law. Make an excuse. Tell them you are going to the pharmacy. Tell them you need to rest. I do not care what you say, but get out of that house immediately. You could be in very real danger." The line went completely dead. A heavy, suffocating silence settled over my bedroom. I lowered the phone, staring at the black screen. Danger. Vincent Caldwell, a man who moved millions of dollars with a single phone call, a man who never panicked, was terrified. And he was telling me to fear my own son. I slowly stood back up, walking quietly over to the mirror hanging above the oak dresser. I looked at my reflection. I looked at the deep lines of grief etched around my mouth, the exhaustion in my eyes. I looked like a weak, broken old man ready to fade away. That pathetic image was exactly what Matthew and Sarah were counting on to execute their plans. They thought I was completely blind, trusting, and too consumed by sorrow to notice their frantic search next door. They had terribly underestimated me. I was an engineer. When I find a crack in a foundation, I never ignore it. I dig until I find the exact source of the rot. I slipped the phone securely back inside my coat pocket, my trembling fingers brushing tightly against the heavy, cold, solid brass shape of Diane's safe keys. I took one very slow, deep breath, brutally burying my crushing grief deep inside my aching chest, exactly where those two traitors could not see it. I wiped my wet face, straightened my tired posture, and silently opened my wooden bedroom door, entirely ready to play the oblivious, helpless old fool. I stepped out of my bedroom, leaning heavily on my wooden cane. I dragged my right foot against the hardwood floor, making sure my approach sounded exactly like the shuffling gait of a broken old man. My heart raced from Vincent Caldwell's call, but I forced my breathing to slow. I let my shoulders slump forward, putting on the mask of a grieving widower lost in sorrow. The hallway seemed incredibly long shadows stretching across the walls as the afternoon storm raged outside. Nearing Diane's office, I heard the frantic rustling of paper. Matthew was tearing through her life, searching for whatever secrets she had locked away. I pushed the heavy door open, letting it creak loudly on its brass hinges. Matthew gasped, jerking upward from where he was kneeling behind Diane's desk. In a flash of panicked movement, he shoved a thick red folder behind his back, hiding it from view. His face flushed, nervous sweat coating his forehead despite the cold draft. He looked like a cornered animal for a second before his polished mask slammed back into place. He stood straight, forcing a strained, unnatural smile. "Dad," he said, his voice pitching slightly higher than usual. "You startled me. I thought you were resting in your room." I stood in the doorway, letting my hands shake on my cane. I looked around the room, letting my eyes widen in manufactured shock. The floor was covered in Diane's meticulously organized files. Her locked filing cabinets had been pried open, their metal tracks bent and distorted. The velvet chair she used to sit in was overturned. I looked at my son, making my voice tremble, with a mixture of confusion and hurt. "Matthew," I stammered, leaning heavily against the doorframe. "What are you doing in here? Your mother never let anyone in this room. What is going on with all these papers?" Matthew took a slow, calculated step forward, keeping his left hand firmly planted behind his back, clutching that hidden folder. He reached out with his free hand, adopting the soothing, condescending tone professionals use to calm down an irate customer. "Dad, listen to me," he said smoothly, his dark eyes locking onto mine with an unsettling intensity. "I know this looks bad. I know Mom was private about her workspace, but I was just trying to help you. I was looking for her life insurance policy." I blinked, tilting my head as if I was struggling to process his words. "Her life insurance policy," I repeated weakly. "Yes, Dad," he continued, his voice dripping with fabricated sincerity. "Sarah and I were talking in the car on the way back from the cemetery. We know how much pressure you are under now. We do not want you to worry about a single financial burden. We want to pay for the entire funeral, the casket, the burial plot, all the hospital bills from when she collapsed. We just need her insurance documents to get the process started and take the weight off your shoulders." It was a brilliant lie. It was exactly the kind of incredibly plausible excuse a loving, devoted son would ever use. If I had not seen him practically destroying the room, if I had not heard Vincent Caldwell's warning, I might have fallen for it completely. But as a structural engineer, I knew exactly how to spot a faulty, weak structural beam. Matthew simply wanted total, unrestricted access to Diane's private accounts. He was using the guise of filial devotion to completely isolate me from my own wife's estate. He was trying to blindfold me. Before I could formulate a response, the sound of rapid footsteps echoed in the hallway behind me. Sarah rushed into the room, stopping abruptly right beside me. She took one look at the ransacked office, then looked at Matthew. A silent, instantaneous communication passed between them. It was a look of pure panic, instantly replaced by a synchronized strategy. Sarah let out a theatrical sob. She threw her hands over her mouth, her shoulders shaking violently. She rushed forward and wrapped her arms tightly around my neck, burying her face into my chest. "Oh, William," she wailed, her voice muffled against my suit jacket. "It is just so hard being in this house without her." Every corner reminds me of Diane. Matthew is just trying to be strong for all of us. He just wants to make sure you do not have to deal with the horrible paperwork right now. We love you so much, William. She squeezed me tighter, her perfume overwhelming my senses. It was a cloying, expensive scent that made my stomach churn. I stood there trapped in the embrace of a woman who had just been eyeing my coat pockets for a safe key like a common thief. I could feel the cold, hard brass of those keys pressing against my ribs, a stark reminder of the reality hiding beneath their sickeningly sweet facade. I raised my trembling hands and patted Sarah's back, forcing myself to play along. "Thank you, Sarah," I whispered, letting my voice crack with manufactured emotion. "You are both so kind to an old man. I am just so overwhelmed by everything. The house feels so empty without her." Matthew finally brought his left hand around, slipping the red folder into his briefcase resting on the desk. He walked over and placed a comforting hand on my shoulder, joining his wife in this grotesque display of family unity. "We know, Dad," Matthew said softly. "That is exactly why you need to let us handle this. You should not be dealing with bankers or lawyers right now. You need time to grieve. Go back to your room and rest. Sarah is going to make you a nice hot cup of tea to calm your nerves. I will finish tidying up here and lock the door so no one disturbs Mom's things again." I nodded slowly, looking at the floor as if completely defeated. "Yes," I murmured. "Yes, you are right. A cup of tea sounds nice. I will go lie down." I turned around, leaning heavily on my cane, and began the slow shuffle back down the hallway. My back was exposed to them, but every nerve in my body was vibrating with high alert. I had seen the folder. I had heard the lie. I had felt the absolute falseness of Sarah's embrace. They thought they had successfully manipulated a grieving, senile old man. They thought their plausible lie had perfectly covered their tracks. But as I walked back into my bedroom and closed the door softly behind me, the facade dropped entirely. My hands stopped shaking. My posture straightened. The sorrow in my eyes hardened into cold, solid steel. Vincent Caldwell had warned me that my life was in danger. Seeing my son and daughter-in-law working seamlessly together to plunder my wife's secure documents confirmed it. They were hunting for something massive, something hidden deep within Diane's financial records, and they were using the tragedy of her sudden death as the perfect smokescreen to steal it right out from under me. I was not going to let that happen. The hours dragged on like a slow execution. I remained in my bedroom as the late afternoon bled into a pitch-black, stormy evening. The freezing rain continued to batter the glass panes of my window, creating a rhythmic drumming sound. Tonight, the relentless storm outside sounded exactly like an impending warning. Downstairs, the continuous hum of Matthew and Sarah conversing drifted up through the wooden floorboards. Their voices were low, urgent, and ceaseless. I sat motionless in my armchair, in the far corner of the room, wrapped tightly in a thick wool blanket, staring intensely at the closed door. I had spent my entire professional career evaluating complex stress metrics and structural thresholds. I knew exactly how much physical pressure a support beam could take before it snapped into violent pieces. Right now, my own flesh and blood was testing my absolute psychological limit. They mistakenly thought I was sitting up here crumbling under the immense weight of grief, completely paralyzed by the sudden loss of Diane. They were boldly banking on my perceived weakness to flawlessly execute their next calculated move. I listened very closely as the heavy thud of footsteps finally began to ascend the wooden staircase. The steps were far too light to be Matthew. It was Sarah. I quickly slumped forward in my leather chair, burying my face deep in my hands, and deliberately practiced my breathing, making it sound painfully shallow and ragged. The brass doorknob turned slowly with a sharp metallic click. William, a soft, incredibly gentle voice whispered from the shadowy doorway. "Are you awake?" I slowly raised my heavy head, letting my eyes blink repeatedly as if I were desperately struggling to focus my failing vision. Sarah stepped gracefully into the dim, ambient light of my quiet, completely isolated bedroom space. She had already changed out of her black funeral dress into comfortable, excessively expensive cashmere loungewear. In her left hand, she perfectly balanced a steaming porcelain teacup on a matching saucer. Tucked securely under her right arm was a remarkably thick manila envelope. She approached my chair with slow, exaggerated caution, treating me exactly like a fragile piece of antique glass that might shatter into a million pieces at any given moment. "I brought you some hot chamomile tea," she said, placing the cup gently on the small mahogany side table right next to my resting, allegedly frail right arm. "You have barely eaten a single thing all day long, and Matthew and I are both very worried about your blood pressure. You really need to drink every drop of this. It will help you relax your tense nerves and get some much-needed deep sleep tonight." I looked closely at the steaming tea, then gazed up at her meticulously painted face. "Thank you, Sarah," I croaked expertly, making my vocal cords sound brittle, weak, and ancient. "You are very thoughtful to check on an old man. I am just so incredibly tired. My chest feels completely hollow right now." She smiled, a tight, sympathetic curve of her pale lips that did not quite reach her cold, calculating eyes. She knelt gracefully beside my chair, placing the heavy manila envelope directly onto my lap. "I know you are exhausted, William," she murmured, resting her warm hand intimately on my knee. "But Matthew explicitly asked me to bring these important documents up to you. It is just some standard probate paperwork for the estate. We simply need your signature on a few dotted lines so we can formally release the necessary funds to pay the funeral home early tomorrow morning's schedule." The director was very clear that they need the payment fully processed before the upcoming weekend. I stared blankly down at the thick envelope resting heavily on my legs. My analytical engineering mind instantly registered the substantial weight and unnatural bulk of the paper inside. Standard probate forms for a simple funeral home release absolutely do not require 40 dense pages of complicated legal text. I reached out with a deliberately trembling hand, letting my unsteady fingers hover over the paper flap. "Are you absolutely sure Matthew cannot just handle this tomorrow afternoon?" I asked carefully, slurring my words slightly. "My eyes are so blurry without my prescription reading glasses. I sincerely do not think I can read all of this complex writing right now." Sarah patted my knee firmly, her grip just a fraction too tight to be genuinely comforting. "Oh, you absolutely do not need to read it all tonight," she insisted smoothly, maintaining her flawless facade. "Matthew already read through every single page for you this afternoon. It is all just standard boilerplate language required by the state of Illinois. We just marked the specific signature lines with little yellow sticky notes to make it incredibly easy. Just sign exactly where the bright arrows point, drink your hot tea, and go straight to sleep. Matthew will take care of filing everything at the downtown courthouse first thing in the morning. You just need to rest your mind and let us handle all the heavy lifting." She stood back up casually, smoothing out a tiny invisible wrinkle in her expensive cashmere sweater. "Please drink the tea while it is still nice and hot, William. It has a very special herbal blend I got from the organic market downtown. It works absolute wonders for severe anxiety and panic stress. I promise you will feel so much better when you wake up in the morning." I reached out with violently shaking fingers and slowly lifted the delicate porcelain cup from the matching saucer. I brought the rim to my lips, blowing softly on the dark surface. The steam curled upward, carrying the sweet floral scent of chamomile, but hidden underneath it, my sharp senses easily picked up a faint, bitter, unnatural chemical odor. It was incredibly subtle, but it was undeniably present. I took a tiny, completely fake sip, letting the hot liquid touch my bottom lip without actually swallowing. "It is very good," I whispered, resting the cup back on the saucer with a clumsy, loud clatter. "Thank you so much for making it. I will sign the papers right now so Matthew has them ready." Sarah beamed brilliantly, clearly thrilled with the apparent success of her own twisted manipulation. "I will leave you to it then," she said, backing slowly toward the open door. "Just leave the envelope on your nightstand when you are entirely finished. Good night, William. Try to find some peace tonight." The heavy wooden door clicked firmly shut, completely sealing me inside the dim room. I immediately grabbed the porcelain cup, walked silently across the bedroom, and poured the entire chemically laced contents deep into the dark soil of a potted fern. Then I pulled my reading glasses from my shirt pocket and opened the thick envelope. The documents had absolutely nothing to do with funeral expenses. It was a comprehensive, durable power of attorney, aggressively designed to grant Matthew total, unrestricted access to all of my personal bank accounts. But the most terrifying discovery was a permanent medical proxy clause granting him the absolute legal right to lock me inside a psychiatric care facility. I sat on the edge of my bed for what felt like hours, listening intensely to the heavy silence of the house. The rhythmic freezing rain continued to slash violently against my bedroom window, creating a wall of static sound that perfectly masked my movements. Below the floorboards, the low conspiratorial murmurs between Matthew and Sarah had finally ceased. I heard the door to the guest room click shut, followed by the heavy, settling quiet that only comes when people believe they have successfully buried a problem. They thought I was dead to the world, drifting into a chemically induced sleep from the tea I had just dumped into the fern. They thought their broad power of attorney and the medical proxy clause were safe in my hands, waiting for a morning signature from a broken old man. I cast the heavy wool blanket aside and stood up. My joints ached, a physical manifestation of the crushing grief and betrayal wrapping around my chest. But my mind was completely clear. I did not use my cane this time. I walked barefoot across the cold floor, stepping with absolute engineering precision on the structural joints of the wooden planks to ensure not a single floorboard would groan. I opened my bedroom door, slipping out into the pitch-black hallway, like a shadow infiltrating a structure that had already collapsed. I slipped inside Diane's ruined office, closing the door soundlessly behind me. The room smelled of dust, overturned wood, and the damp air entering from the slightly splintered doorframe. I did not dare turn on the desk lamp. Instead, I pulled out my cell phone, using the dim gray glow of the screen to guide my eyes over the wreckage Matthew had left behind. Papers were strewn everywhere, client portfolios tossed aside like worthless garbage. But Matthew had been sloppy. He was a financial planner driven by sudden, panicked greed, not a structural engineer trained to look at the invisible load-bearing points of an environment. He had looked at the obvious places, tearing through the filing cabinets and ripping open the drawers. He had completely missed the foundation. I walked over to the tall mahogany bookshelf that lined the far wall. I bypassed the pulled-out binders and the empty slots. I reached my hand behind the third shelf, counting exactly 5 rows down from the top, precisely where the heavy architectural design volumes rested. My fingers brushed against a small, hidden magnetic latch attached to the back of the wood paneling. With a soft click, a false back behind the books popped open by an inch. I reached into the narrow, dark cavity. My breath caught in my throat. The space was completely empty. Diane's black leather ledger was gone. That book was her absolute sanctuary. For 20 years, as Vincent Caldwell's trusted assistant, she used that ledger to manually document every off-the-books transaction, every secure encrypted passcode, and every private offshore routing number for Caldwell Investments. It was her ultimate insurance policy, a physical backup of a digital empire. She explicitly told me that if that ledger ever left her hands, it meant the entire structure of Caldwell Investments was being targeted. Matthew and Sarah had clearly found it before I walked in on them. That was the specific red folder Matthew had frantically hidden behind his back. A cold sweat broke out across my neck. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. They did not just happen to stumble upon her files after she died. They knew exactly what she was keeping. They had been planning this heist while Diane was still alive. I dropped to my knees amidst the sea of scattered documents on the floor, my hands moving with urgent, focused speed. I began to cross-reference the remaining financial statements Matthew had deemed useless and left behind. I picked up Diane's personal banking folders, her corporate credit card statements, and the internal wire transfer logs from Caldwell Investments that she had printed out over the last 3 months. I turned the screen brightness of my phone down to a sliver of light, illuminating the rows of figures, dates, and bank routing numbers. As a structural engineer, I spent 40 years identifying anomalies in massive datasets, looking for the single decimal error that could bring an entire skyscraper crashing down. It took me less than 10 minutes to find the fatal fracture in the numbers. There was a massive wire transfer documented on a printed corporate ledger sheet from Caldwell Investments. Exactly $8 million had been moved out of Vincent Caldwell's primary liquidity reserve account. The destination was an offshore entity listed as Vanguard Luxury Holdings, a shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands. But it was not the destination that made my heart stop. It was the timestamp of the transaction. The $8 million was fully cleared and transferred at precisely 10 o'clock a.m. on Monday morning. My hands began to shake violently, the paper rattling in my grip. I forced myself to stare at the digital clock on my phone, checking the date on the document again. Monday morning at 10 o'clock. Diane had collapsed on our kitchen floor at precisely 4 o'clock p.m. on that exact same Monday. The invisible dots instantly connected in my mind, forming a picture of absolute horror. The massive wire transfer of Vincent's millions had occurred exactly 6 hours before my wife suffered her sudden fatal heart attack. This was not a standard case of opportunistic corporate fraud. This was a clinical, cold-blooded execution. Diane was a woman of fanatical professional integrity. There was absolutely no scenario on Earth where she would have authorized an $8 million illicit transfer to a luxury fashion shell company while Vincent was alive. She had caught the transfer. She had seen the anomaly on her monitor at the office, printed out the proof, and brought it home in that red folder. She had realized that her own son Matthew, using his high-level security clearance as a consulting financial planner for Caldwell Investments, had stolen her biometric passcodes to authorize the theft. She had confronted him, or she was about to confront him. And exactly 6 hours later, her heart mysteriously stopped beating. I collapsed backward against the mahogany desk, the air completely rushing out of my lungs. The grief that had been a dull ache for days suddenly transformed into a burning, roaring furnace of pure rage. The pieces of the puzzle fell into place with terrifying mathematical precision. Matthew and Sarah did not want to pay for the funeral out of love. They needed to secure the power of attorney and get my legal signature on those broad probate documents tonight, so they could permanently lock down the $8 million before Vincent Caldwell completed his internal audit. And the medical proxy clause was their insurance policy to throw me into an asylum if I ever started asking the right questions about the medication in Diane's cabinet. I held the wire transfer sheet against my chest, listening to the relentless wind howling outside the house. My own son had looked at his mother's 45 years of devotion and decided she was completely disposable. He had looked at me and decided I was just a clueless lamb-cam old man who could be easily medicated into silence. They thought they were the masterminds of a perfect crime, but they had completely forgotten who built the very foundation they were standing on. I stood up, my posture straighter than it had been in years, my eyes locked on the dark hallway. The structure of this family was entirely rotten, and I was going to be the one to systematically tear it down. I left the sanctuary of Diane's office, pulling the heavy door shut until the latch clicked. I stood in the dark hallway listening to the house. The clock downstairs chimed softly, marking 2 in the morning. The rain was hammering against the siding, masking any sound I made. My mind was moving with icy clarity. I had the corporate ledger sheet. I knew $8 million had been bled from Vincent Caldwell's reserves into an offshore ghost entity called Vanguard Luxury Holdings. But I needed the physical bridge. I needed the concrete proof connecting my son and my daughter-in-law to that specific account. Matthew was arrogant, but he was also fundamentally lazy. He always believed his intelligence was vastly superior to everyone else. That kind of profound arrogance breeds carelessness. If Sarah and Matthew were coordinating local transfers to secure their newly stolen wealth, they would have generated physical paper trails, deposit slips, wire transfer confirmations, temporary account numbers written down in haste. They would not leave those in the open, but they would certainly dispose of them. I gripped the banister and began my descent. The darkness wrapped around me. Every shadow felt like a spectator. I bypassed the living room and moved toward the mudroom connecting to the garage. The cold tile seeped through my thin socks. I turned the deadbolt, slowly easing the heavy steel door open. The air inside was freezing, smelling of damp concrete, motor oil, and the heavy rain pouring outside. I did not turn on the overhead lights. The harsh glare would easily bleed through the window blinds and alert anyone upstairs. Instead, I grabbed a small tactical flashlight from my workbench. I clicked it on, keeping the beam aimed strictly at the concrete floor. I swept the narrow circle of light toward the large green garbage bins lined up against the far wall. Matthew had insisted on taking out the trash immediately after we returned from the cemetery. He had claimed the kitchen smelled of stale food and wilted sympathy flowers. It was a bizarre, urgent chore for a supposedly grieving son to prioritize on the day he buried his mother. Now the reason was glaringly obvious. He needed to purge evidence. I approached the bins, lifting the heavy lid. Inside sat 3 tightly knotted black garbage bags. I grabbed the top bag, hauled it out, and carried it over to my workbench. I pulled a sharp utility knife from my toolbox and sliced the thick plastic down the center. The bag spilled mundane refuse across the stained wood. Coffee grounds, soaked paper towels, empty food cartons. I pushed through the damp mess with my bare hands, ignoring the grime. I was hunting for the structural flaw. I dug deeper, reaching the very bottom of the bag. My fingers brushed against a dense clump of paper. I pulled it free. It was a thick handful of coarsely shredded documents. Matthew had not used the industrial shredder in Diane's office because the noise would have drawn my attention. Instead, he had simply ripped the pages into jagged vertical ribbons. It was a sloppy, rushed attempt to destroy financial records. I swept the remaining garbage aside and spread the torn strips across the wide surface of my workbench. I dragged a heavy stool over, sat down, and turned on my small work lamp. The focused beam of light illuminated a chaotic jigsaw puzzle of numbers, barcodes, and corporate logos. For the next hour, the freezing temperature of the garage completely faded away. I was no longer a grieving husband. I was a structural engineer analyzing a catastrophic failure. I picked up a roll of clear adhesive tape and began the agonizing process of reconstructing the shredded pages. I matched the torn edges aligning the blue ink lines of bank logos and the rigid black text of routing numbers. My hands, which had trembled so violently just hours ago, were now as steady as solid stone. The precision required for the task pushed my boiling rage down into a cold, highly compressed core. Slowly, the jagged ribbons began to form a cohesive picture. The first document I managed to tape together was a confirmation of incorporation from the state of Delaware. The company listed was Vanguard Luxury Holdings. The registered agent was a generic corporate service, but the secondary contact information was glaringly familiar. It listed a private post office box in downtown Chicago, the exact same post office box Sarah used for her high-end fashion shipments. I kept working my focus, narrowing into a sharp, lethal point. The second document was much harder to assemble. The strips were thinner, the text smaller. It took me 20 agonizing minutes to align the columns of numbers. When I smoothed the last piece of tape over the paper, the truth hit me with absolute, undeniable certainty. It was an international wire transfer receipt from a private offshore bank in the Cayman Islands. The sender was Vanguard Luxury Holdings. The receiving account was a newly opened domestic business line of credit. The name of the receiving entity was printed in bold, undeniable black ink. It was the official corporate registration name for Sarah's boutique. The exact amount transferred was $8 million. They had not merely stolen the money and parked it offshore. They had actively routed the entire stolen fortune back into the United States, funneling it directly through Sarah's failing business to wash it clean. They were using her legitimate retail storefront as a massive money laundering operation. The stolen funds would be categorized as a sudden influx of private investment capital. Matthew had engineered the financial flow perfectly, ensuring the money would ultimately land safely in their joint accounts. I stared down at the taped documents resting under the harsh glow of the work lamp. The evidence was irrefutable. My son and daughter-in-law had systematically robbed my wife's billionaire employer, murdered the woman who gave Matthew life, and were now eagerly waiting for me to sign away my freedom. They were sleeping soundly in my guest room, dreaming of luxury cars, expensive vacations, and a lifetime of unearned wealth, completely confident that their gruesome crimes were securely buried. A strange, terrifying calm washed over my entire body. The heavy, suffocating grief that had anchored me to the floor since Diane's death completely evaporated. It was gone, replaced by a crystalline, predatory clarity. I was no longer mourning. I was preparing for war. I carefully gathered the fully reconstructed documents, sliding them into a thick, plastic sleeve from my toolbox. I folded the protective sleeve and tucked it securely into the tight waistband of my trousers. I turned off the work lamp, completely plunging the garage back into cold darkness. I slowly walked back toward the mudroom door, my footsteps silent and deliberate. The structural integrity of my family was completely decimated, and the foundation was nothing but ash and blood. I was going to let Matthew and Sarah believe they had won. I was going to let them stand proudly on their new foundation of stolen millions, and then I was going to detonate the ground right underneath their feet. Morning light crept through the blinds, casting pale lines across my bed. I had not slept a minute. When I walked downstairs, I made sure my steps were slow. I leaned on the handrail, letting out a groan as I reached the bottom. Matthew and Sarah were in the kitchen. They fell silent when my cane tapped the tile. "Good morning, Dad," Matthew said, pulling out a chair. "How did you sleep?" "You look incredibly pale." I pressed my hand against my chest, letting my breathing hitch to simulate genuine physical distress. "I feel terrible, Matthew," I whispered. "My chest is tight." I called my cardiologist. His receptionist is squeezing me in for an electrocardiogram at 10. Sarah exchanged a rapid glance with Matthew. The prospect of my physical collapse perfectly aligned with their malicious narrative. But Matthew played the concerned son. "Dad, you cannot drive in this condition," Matthew insisted, reaching for his keys. "Let me drive you. I can wait." I raised a trembling hand, shutting down his offer. "No, Matthew," I said. "I need to do this alone. Your mother and I always drove to that clinic together. I just need quiet space. Please stay here and manage the house. I will call you with the results." Giving him the house granted him uninterrupted hours to tear apart the hidden compartments he missed yesterday. He lowered his keys, adopting a look of reluctant compliance. "Of course, Dad," he murmured. "Take all the time you need. We will be right here." I walked to my sedan, moving with deliberate slowness, until I closed the heavy door. The second the engine roared to life, my trembling ceased completely. I merged onto the highway, driving directly to the headquarters of Caldwell Investments in downtown Chicago. The building was an intimidating fortress. I parked in the VIP garage, taking a private elevator straight up to the top executive floor. Vincent Caldwell was waiting in his corner office. Vincent was a billionaire who built his empire through sheer brilliance. Today his face was etched with profound anger. "William," Vincent said, bypassing polite pleasantries as he locked the door behind me. "Thank God you got out safely. Did they suspect anything?" I shook my head, pulling the plastic sleeve from my coat pocket and laying the shredded documents on the wood. "They think I am getting my heart checked," I replied smoothly. "I found these in the garage trash bins this morning." Matthew and Sarah routed exactly $8 million through a Caribbean shell corporation straight into Sarah's boutique account. Vincent stared down at the jagged strips of paper. He did not look surprised, only deeply vindicated. "I knew it," Vincent hissed, slamming his fist against the desk. "I spent the night running a shadow audit on the mainframe. They completely bypassed our secondary firewalls, William. And I know exactly how they managed to do it." I sat in the leather chair across from him, crossing my hands over my cane. "Tell me," I said quietly. Vincent paced across his office. Diane was the only person with the specific biometric passcodes to authorize a transfer of that magnitude. Someone physically cloned her security credentials. They replicated her digital fingerprint and her voice authorization protocol. It takes a sophisticated understanding of financial networks to pull off a hack like that without triggering a federal alarm. Matthew is a senior financial planner, I stated, feeling the cold reality settle deep in my bones. He knows the architecture of corporate banking systems. He knew what invisible wires to cut. "Exactly," Vincent continued. "He used his professional knowledge to mask the initial breach. He scheduled the illicit transfer to execute exactly 6 hours before Diane suffered her fatal collapse. Diane was too smart, William. She noticed the pending anomaly on her terminal. She confronted him. I am absolutely certain of it. And Matthew realized she was going to expose his operation. My chest tightened, sorrow mixing with my escalating rage. "Why have you not called the police, Vincent?" I asked. "Why are we hiding in the shadows if we have the proof?" "Because if I involve federal authorities right now, the news of an $8 million breach will leak to the press within an hour," Vincent explained. "The stock market will panic. My clients will pull their investments. Matthew will instantly freeze the offshore accounts and transfer the money into an untraceable crypto wallet. If we move blindly, we lose the money forever, and he walks away free. We need to build an inescapable trap. We need to completely destroy his financial safety net before we lock him in a cage." "And how do we do that?" I asked, leaning forward in my chair. Vincent pressed a hidden button under his desk. The heavy oak paneling on the far side of the room slid open seamlessly, revealing a concealed office space. A woman stepped out into the light. She was tall, dressed in a sharp gray suit with piercing blue eyes that radiated absolute calculating authority. She carried a sleek silver laptop under her arm. "William, this is Melissa," Vincent said. "She is my director of private security. Before joining my firm, she spent 15 years working as a forensic accountant and lab investigator for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. She specializes in dismantling organized financial crime syndicates." Melissa walked forward, offering an exceptionally strong handshake. "William," she said, her voice entirely devoid of warmth, "I am deeply sorry for the tragic loss of your wife. Diane was a remarkable woman. I promise you we are going to dismantle every single thing your son has built, and we are going to make him suffer immensely in the process." I looked at the ex-federal investigator, absorbing the sheer gravity of the alliance I was forming. "I am listening, Melissa," I said firmly. "What is our first move?" Melissa opened her laptop, placing it directly over the shredded documents. "Matthew and Sarah think they hold all the cards because they have you trapped under the threat of a medical proxy," she explained, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "We are going to use their own boundless greed against them. They expect you to sign that power of attorney tonight. I want you to sign it." I frowned, gripping my cane tighter. "You want me to hand them the keys to my entire life?" I asked, confused. "I want you to hand them a live grenade disguised as a key," Melissa corrected, a predatory smile touching her lips. "I spent the morning setting up dummy accounts mimicking your personal wealth. When Matthew attempts to use that signed document to access your funds, he will unknowingly bridge his corrupted network directly into my surveillance servers. We will have unrestricted legal access to every single keystroke he makes. We are going to bleed his accounts dry, redirect the stolen $8 million back to Vincent, and leave Matthew holding a massive pile of federal tax fraud evidence." The brilliance of the strategy was undeniable. We were going to let my traitorous son dig his own inescapable grave. I nodded slowly, sealing our underground alliance. "Let us destroy him," I whispered. I left the hidden office feeling a strange sense of profound clarity. Melissa had handed me a sleek black reinforced titanium case before I departed. Inside the case rested 6 state-of-the-art micro-surveillance cameras. They were incredibly small, no larger than a standard shirt button, equipped with high-definition lenses, infrared night vision, and encrypted wireless transmitters. Melissa explained that these were the exact same specialized devices her former bureau units used to monitor high-value targets in hostile environments. They did not rely on standard home wireless networks. Instead, they broadcasted their encrypted feeds directly to a secure, isolated server located in the sub-basement of Caldwell Investments. Matthew, despite all of his supposed technical brilliance, would never be able to detect the transmission signals. I placed the heavy titanium case on the passenger seat of my sedan and drove back toward the house. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the suburban streets slick and gray under the heavy afternoon clouds. My chest did not ache anymore. The paralyzing grief that had threatened to consume me just 24 hours ago had been completely burned away, leaving behind a cold, calculating desire for absolute justice. I was a structural engineer returning to a condemned building, carrying the tools needed to document its inevitable collapse. When I pulled my car into the driveway, I noticed Matthew and Sarah had taken her luxury SUV. The house was entirely silent, completely devoid of their suffocating false sympathy. I walked through the front door, leaning heavily on my wooden cane purely out of habit, before realizing I no longer needed to maintain the pathetic charade. I stood up straight, letting my spine crack and settle into its natural posture. I walked into the kitchen and found a hastily scribbled note resting on the granite countertop. Dad Matthew had written with a thick blue marker. Sarah and I went out to run a few necessary errands and clear our heads. We will bring back a hot dinner. Please get some rest. I scoffed quietly, tossing the cheap paper into the stainless steel sink. I knew exactly what kind of errands they were running. Armed with the absolute certainty that they were about to inherit $8 million in stolen corporate funds, they were already spending the money in their minds. They were out test-driving European luxury cars, picking out custom leather interiors and celebrating their successful heist. Their staggering arrogance was their greatest vulnerability. They had left the house completely unguarded, giving me the perfect, uninterrupted window of time I needed to transform my own home into an inescapable digital panopticon. I opened the titanium case on the kitchen island and pulled out the first micro camera. My engineering background made this precise installation process feel incredibly natural. I needed vantage points that offered maximum visibility without drawing any unwanted attention. I moved a decorative ceramic vase on the top shelf of the kitchen cabinetry, attaching the tiny black lens to the shadowy lip of the wood. It provided a sweeping, unobstructed overhead view of the entire kitchen, the breakfast nook, and the hallway leading to the front door. I could see the exact spot where Diane had collapsed. The painful memory fueled my precision. Next, I moved into the spacious living room. This was where Matthew and Sarah spent their evenings whispering their toxic plans. I found a cluster of family photographs resting on the stone mantel above the fireplace. Ironically, it was a silver-framed picture of Matthew from his college graduation. I carefully adhered the second micro camera to the dark edge of the metal frame. The lens pointed directly at the large leather sofa where they usually sat. Every spoken word, every stolen glance, and every hushed celebration of their perceived victory would be recorded in pristine high-definition audio and video. I stepped back, examining my work. The tiny devices were completely invisible to the naked eye. The hunter had officially laid the trap, and the prey was entirely oblivious. The most critical location was Diane's office. I climbed the wooden stairs, my footsteps firm and deliberate. I unlocked the heavy door and stepped into the ransacked room. Matthew had attempted to clean up his mess, but the space still felt violently violated. I walked over to the tall mahogany bookshelf where the black ledger had been stolen. I placed the third camera discreetly behind the edge of a thick, decorative bookend, angling the lens to capture the entire span of the mahogany desk and the heavy filing cabinets. Anyone entering this sanctuary would be immediately documented. I placed a fourth camera inside the ventilation grate near the ceiling, ensuring a secondary redundant viewing angle. I knew Matthew would inevitably return to this room. He would want to double-check his tracks, searching for any lingering loose ends before the funeral. The cameras would capture his every move, providing the definitive, unshakable evidence Melissa needed to seal his absolute destruction. My heart beat with a steady, rhythmic thrum as I meticulously adjusted the delicate, microscopic lenses, ensuring the perfect focal depth for the recorded feeds. The sheer mechanics of the operation gave me a profound sense of purpose. I was dismantling my son's empire piece by piece. I still had 2 cameras remaining in the protective titanium case. I thought about where they would discuss their most intimate, unguarded secrets. The guest bedroom. I moved down the hall, slipping silently into the room they were currently occupying. Their suitcases were carelessly thrown on the floor. Sarah had left her expensive jewelry scattered across the vanity. I placed the 5th camera directly inside the hollow base of a bedside lamp, pointing it straight at the center of the mattress. I took the final camera and positioned it seamlessly behind the ventilation slats of the attached guest bathroom. I wanted absolutely 0 blind spots. Every single corner of their private existence in my house was now under rigorous, unrelenting surveillance. With the physical installation completely finished, I retreated to my own bedroom and pulled out the encrypted tablet Melissa had provided. I powered the device on entering the complex alphanumeric passcode she had memorized for me. The black screen immediately flickered to life, splitting into 6 crystal-clear video feeds. I watched the empty kitchen, the vacant living room couch, the pristine guest bedroom, and the dark corners of Diane's office. The sensitive audio transmission picked up the subtle ticking of the grandfather clock downstairs, rendering the silence absolute. The acoustic clarity was nothing short of breathtaking. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator motor echoing all the way from the kitchen floor. I possessed total, uncompromising control over my domain once again. This house was no longer their safe haven. It had been permanently transformed into a technological prison specifically designed to capture their overwhelming greed on digital video. The trap was fully armed and operational. I shut down the tablet, hiding it securely beneath the loose floorboard under my bed. I sat down in my leather armchair, pulled the blanket up, rested my hands on my cane, and waited for the traitors to return. The heavy rumble of the garage door opening broke the silence of the house shortly after 6 o'clock. I remained seated in my armchair for a few minutes, listening to the muffled sounds of their arrival. Car doors slammed shut. Footsteps echoed heavily in the mudroom. I heard the rustling of paper bags and the low, self-satisfied hum of their voices carrying clearly through the floorboards. They were back from their shopping spree, entirely unaware that the walls were now watching their every move. I reached down, retrieved my wooden cane, and practiced my trembling grip. I forced my shoulders to hunch forward, letting the weight of manufactured exhaustion settle deep into my bones. I shuffled out of my bedroom and made my slow, agonizing descent down the wooden staircase. When I reached the kitchen, the rich aroma of roasted chicken and garlic potatoes filled the air. Matthew was standing by the granite island, pouring an expensive bottle of red wine into 2 crystal glasses. Sarah was transferring the takeout food onto our good porcelain plates. The sheer audacity of their domestic performance was staggering. They had spent the afternoon purchasing luxury vehicles with stolen money, and now they were playing house. I tapped my cane loudly against the tile floor. Matthew turned around immediately, replacing his relaxed demeanor with a mask of deep paternal concern. He set the wine bottle down and rushed over, placing a supportive hand beneath my elbow. "Dad, you should have called us." Matthew said smoothly, guiding me forward. "We would have brought the food up to you on a tray. How are you feeling? Did you manage to get any sleep?" I let out a weak, rattling sigh, allowing my head to droop. "I tried, Matthew," I whispered, my voice trembling perfectly. but every time I close my eyes, I just see your mother. The house feels so terribly cold without her. My mind just keeps racing in circles. I cannot seem to remember simple things today. Sarah walked over, wiping her pristine hands on a dish towel. Her face was the picture of perfect sympathy, but I could clearly see the gleam of triumph dancing in her pale blue eyes. "Oh, William," she murmured, guiding me toward the dining room table. "That is completely normal. Grief is so exhausting. It plays terrible tricks on the mind. You just need a hot meal and some company. We are right here for you." I allowed them to pull out a chair and ease me down into it. The dining room was bathed in the warm golden glow of the chandelier. Directly above us, hidden seamlessly in the decorative crown molding, one of Melissa's microcameras was capturing the entire scene in brilliant high definition. I stared at the steaming plate of food placed in front of me, my hands shaking so badly that my fork clattered against the porcelain. Matthew sat across from me, sipping his wine with deliberate casualness. "So, Dad," he began, his tone remarkably conversational. "Did you happen to look over that paperwork Sarah brought you earlier? The probate forms for the funeral director. We really need to get those filed first thing tomorrow morning to avoid any delays with the service." I blinked slowly, looking up at him with wide, vacant eyes. I let my mouth hang open for a fraction of a second before speaking. "Paperwork?" I asked, slurring the word slightly. "Which paperwork, Matthew? My head is just a thick fog. Did Sarah bring me something? I thought she only brought me tea." A fleeting look of annoyance crossed Matthew's face, but he quickly suppressed it. He glanced at Sarah, who offered a tiny, reassuring nod. The camera above us recorded the silent, smug exchange. They genuinely believed my cognitive functions were rapidly deteriorating under the severe stress of Diane's passing. "Yes, Dad," Matthew said, leaning forward and speaking loudly as if addressing a small, dim-witted child. "The manila envelope. The legal release forms for the estate. We need your signature so we can pay for Mom's arrangements." "Oh, the envelope," I mumbled, rubbing my forehead with a trembling hand. "Yes, I remember now. I am so sorry, Matthew." I looked at the pages, but the legal jargon was just so confusing. My vision kept swimming. There were so many clauses about bank accounts and proxies. It did not look like a simple funeral receipt. I got a little overwhelmed and put it in my drawer. Sarah's smile tightened, her fingers gripping the stem of her wineglass. "William," she said sweetly, "you do not need to read the difficult parts. It is just standard state bureaucracy. They always make things sound incredibly complicated to justify their high legal fees. We just want to protect you from dealing with greedy lawyers right now." I sighed heavily, picking up a piece of chicken with my fork, only to let it drop back onto the plate. "You are right, Sarah. You are both so capable. I just do not know what I would do without you. Your mother handled all our finances for 40 years. She kept everything so strictly organized in that little black ledger of hers. Have you found it, by the way? I cannot seem to remember where she kept it." The temperature in this dining room seemed to drop 10 degrees in an instant. Matthew completely froze, his wineglass halting halfway to his mouth. Sarah's eyes widened slightly, her breathing suddenly shallow. I kept my gaze fixed blankly on my plate, playing the innocent, confused widower, but my periphery caught every microsecond of their terrified reaction. The camera above us was capturing pure gold, a black ledger. Matthew finally asked, forcing a light, dismissive chuckle. "I do not think I have seen a black ledger, Dad. Mom had so many files. She probably threw it out ages ago." "Are you sure you are not just confusing it with an old address book?" I shook my head slowly, maintaining my fragile facade. "No, she had it recently. She told me it was incredibly important for Vincent Caldwell's accounts. She said it was her insurance policy. Oh well, my memory is just failing me today. It will turn up eventually. I am just so tired." Sarah quickly stood up, grabbing my untouched plate. "You need rest, William. Do not worry about old books or bank accounts tonight. We will find whatever you need tomorrow. Let me help you back up to your room." I nodded, allowing her to pull me to my feet. As I leaned on my cane and began the slow shuffle back toward the stairs, I caught a brief glimpse of Matthew out of the corner of my eye. He was staring fiercely at Sarah, his face pale and slick with nervous sweat. The seed of paranoia had been successfully planted deep in their minds. I played the fool perfectly, ensuring their absolute confidence was slowly unraveling. I returned to my bedroom and allowed Sarah to tuck the heavy wool blanket around my shoulders. She turned off the bedside lamp, whispering a hollow goodnight before pulling the door firmly shut. I remained completely motionless in the pitch-black room for 20 long minutes, listening to her footsteps retreat down the hallway. Once the house settled into a heavy, oppressive silence, I threw off the blanket and moved swiftly across the floor. I reached under the loose floorboard and retrieved the encrypted tablet. The cool metal felt grounding in my hands. I walked over to the armchair, sitting in the darkest corner of the room, and powered on the screen. The vivid digital mosaic of my home sprang to life. I lowered the brightness to a faint, ghostly glow and inserted a small, wireless earpiece. The audio feeds instantly flooded my ear with the ambient sounds of the lower floor. I scanned the 6 camera feeds. The living room was empty. Diane's office was undisturbed. The guest bedroom remained dark. I switched my focus to the kitchen camera. The high-definition infrared lens illuminated the room in sharp monochrome detail. Matthew and Sarah were standing rigidly by the granite island, completely bathed in the shadows of the unlit kitchen. The digital timer on the screen read midnight. Matthew was pacing frantically back and forth across the tile, running his hands roughly through his hair. Sarah stood perfectly still, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, watching him with a venomous glare. The smug, victorious facade they had maintained during dinner was completely gone. They looked like 2 desperate criminals cornered in an alleyway. "You told me the Black Ledger was destroyed." Sarah hissed, her voice a sharp, furious whisper cutting through the quiet night. "You promised me you got rid of it before she died, Matthew. If he is looking for it, if he knows it holds the offshore routing numbers, we are completely exposed." "I did destroy it," Matthew snapped back, his voice trembling with barely suppressed panic. "I burned every single page in the fireplace yesterday morning while he was at the funeral home making arrangements. The old man is just confused. He is grieving. His mind is playing tricks on him. He does not actually know anything about the $8 million. Sarah stepped forward, grabbing his arm forcefully. "Are you absolutely certain? Because if he finds out we routed Vincent Caldwell's liquidity reserve through my business account, we are going to federal prison." The boutique was supposed to look like it secured a massive, legitimate private investment. If the paper trail connects back to Diane's biometric passcodes, the FBI will tear our lives apart. Matthew pulled his arm away, rubbing his face in exhaustion. "The paper trail is buried, Sarah. The Cayman Island Shell Corporation is impenetrable. I used Mom's digital fingerprint to authorize the transfer, and then I wiped the internal servers. Vincent will just assume it was a highly sophisticated external hack. He will never look at a junior financial planner. We just need to get my father to sign the power of attorney tomorrow morning. Once I control his estate, we have total financial insulation." Sarah let out a bitter, mocking laugh. "Total insulation. You are a fool, Matthew. We are only in this terrifying position because of your mother. She was too smart. She found the routing anomaly on her terminal before the transfer fully cleared." I gripped the edges of the tablet, my knuckles turning stark white. My breath caught in my throat as I leaned closer to the glowing screen, hanging onto every single word transmitting through the earpiece. "Do not talk about my mother right now," Matthew warned, his tone suddenly dropping into a dangerous, defensive register. Sarah ignored him, her voice rising in frantic intensity. "I will talk about her because she almost destroyed everything. I was standing right there in the living room when she confronted you on Monday afternoon. She had the printed logs. She knew you had stolen her passcodes. She was going to pick up the phone and call Vincent Caldwell right there on the spot. She was going to tell Vincent about the boutique's funding. Your mother was going to ruin us." Matthew lunged forward, pressing his hands flat against the granite counter, his head hanging low. "I know." He whispered, his voice cracking with a sickening mixture of guilt and relief. I know what she was going to do. Then you know we had no other choice. Sarah continued, her words cold and merciless. When her chest started hurting, when she fell to the floor gasping for air, you did exactly what had to be done. You took her phone away. You locked the front door. And we waited. We waited until she stopped moving before we called the paramedics. We protected our future Matthew. You cannot let a senile old man's rambling about a black ledger make you lose your nerve now. The audio feed echoed in my ear, a damning, horrifying confession of pure murder by deliberate omission. My son had watched the woman who gave him life suffer a massive cardiac event, and instead of calling for help, he had actively prevented her survival to protect his stolen wealth. He had let my Diane die on the kitchen floor, while he stood over her clutching her stolen documents. A single tear slipped down my cheek, hot and stinging against my cold skin. But I did not wipe it away. I hit the save button on the encrypted tablet, securely locking the high-definition video and audio files into the isolated servers in Vincent Caldwell's sub-basement. The evidence was absolutely bulletproof. I had the motive, I had the financial records, and now I had the confession of their horrific crime. I placed the tablet gently on the bedside table and stood up. The psychological warfare was entirely over. The time for playing the weak, confused old man had officially come to an end. Tomorrow morning, when the sun rose, I was going to unleash an absolute inferno upon them, burning their stolen empire to the ground and sending them straight into the darkest cell of a federal penitentiary. I watched the glowing tablet screen, my breath hitching, as the digital feed transmitted pure depravity right into my earpiece. The kitchen was bathed in stark gray infrared light, casting long shadows across the granite countertops. Matthew and Sarah were no longer just arguing. They were circling each other like starved predators, their confidence shattering under the crushing weight of shared guilt. Sarah paced the kitchen island, her manicured fingers digging viciously into her own arms. She was a woman entirely consumed by the terrifying prospect of losing her unearned wealth. You do not seem to comprehend the catastrophic danger we are in right now, Sarah hissed, her voice vibrating with a hysterical edge. Vincent Caldwell is not some clueless old man you can manipulate with chamomile tea. He is a ruthless billionaire. If he finds a single microscopic trace of that $8 million transfer routed through my boutique, he will unleash federal investigators on us. Diane knew that. She knew exactly what you were doing. Matthew slammed his palms against the stone counter, his face twisting into a mask of fury. Do you honestly think I do not know that? Matthew growled, his voice dropping into a guttural register. Do you think I enjoyed watching my own mother fall? I saw the documents she was printing out. But it was not just about the Caldwell money. It was about our entire future. She was actively trying to destroy us. I leaned closer to the screen, gripping the cold metal tablet. The air in my bedroom felt unbearably thick. What are you talking about? Sarah demanded, stopping her frantic pacing. Matthew let out a ragged breath, shaking his head. I found her private legal correspondence on Monday morning, right before I authorized the offshore wire, he confessed. She was drafting a massive, irrevocable revision to her will. She called it the character clause. She told her lawyer she discovered the absolute depths of my greed, calling it the ashes of greed that would burn this family. She was writing me out of the estate completely. She was legally redirecting the deed to the entire Montana estate straight to a pediatric cancer charity. She was donating our Montana estate to a children's hospital just to ensure I never saw a single dime. Sarah gasped, her eyes widening in absolute horror. She was giving the estate to a hospital, Sarah whispered, her voice laced with pure disgust. Yes, Matthew spat, his face flushed with violent anger. She was leaving us with absolutely nothing. If I had let her walk out the front door, she would have driven straight to Caldwell and then straight to her lawyer to sign away my inheritance. I had to stop her, Sarah. I had no other choice but to eliminate the immediate threat. She left me with no other option. Sarah stepped forward, her voice trembling with a sudden realization. But a heart attack, Matthew, she stammered, looking at him as if finally seeing the true monster hiding beneath his tailored suit. It was just too perfectly timed. What if the medical examiner looked closer? What if Vincent demands a private autopsy? We are sitting on a ticking time bomb. Matthew grabbed her by the shoulders, his fingers digging into her cashmere sweater. He leaned in close, completely devoid of human empathy. I handled it. Matthew snapped back his words sharp and utterly devoid of remorse. I swapped her heart medication with a lethal dose of beta blockers. I crushed the pills, dissolved them in her coffee, and watched her drink every drop. The coroner ruled it a completely natural heart attack because she had a documented history of minor cardiac arrhythmia. There was absolutely no reason to run a toxicology screen. We are in the clear. The words echoed through my earpiece, ringing in my head with the deafening force of a structural collapse. I swapped her heart medication with a lethal dose. The tablet slipped from my violently trembling, entirely numb fingers. It hit the hardwood floor with a sharp, heavy thud. My lungs seized, unable to draw in a single breath. The room began to spin violently, the darkness pressing in. I fell to my knees, clutching my chest, as a wave of unadulterated agony ripped through my physical being. Diane was not just the victim of a sudden medical emergency. She had not simply succumbed to the overwhelming stress of discovering our son's financial crimes. She had been deliberately, meticulously, and brutally murdered. The boy we had raised, the tiny infant I had rocked to sleep in the quiet hours of the night, the young man we had proudly supported through a prestigious business school, had deliberately poisoned his own mother. He had looked her directly in the eyes, smiled his charming, deceptive smile, and handed her a cup of lethal coffee purely to secure a stolen fortune and a sprawling piece of land in Montana. He had watched the brilliant woman who gave him life violently gasp for breath on the cold kitchen floor, completely paralyzed by the massive, unnatural failure of her own heart, and he had done absolutely nothing but wait for her pulse to fade away into permanent silence. A ragged, agonizing sob tore its way out of my throat, raw and utterly broken. I pressed my tear-stained face hard against the cold, unforgiving floorboards, openly weeping for my brilliant, fiercely protective wife, who did not deserve such a cruel end. Diane had died valiantly, trying to shield Vincent Caldwell's entire company and trying to legally protect the children's hospital from our son's insatiable sociopathic greed. She had fought for justice until her very last breath. I lay in the freezing darkness, allowing the crushing, devastating sorrow to wash over me in violent waves. I mourned the absolute loss of my wife, the permanent destruction of my family, and the horrifying truth that my only child was a ruthless killer. But as the minutes ticked by, dragging into the early hours of the morning, the blinding tears slowly began to stop. The profound grief that brought me to my knees crystallized into something entirely different. It hardened into a terrifying, unbreakable resolve. The structural engineer inside me, the meticulous man who had successfully spent 40 years constantly calculating the exact breaking point of massive, towering commercial edifices, finally took complete control of my utterly shattered mind. Matthew believed he had executed the perfect crime. He believed he had successfully eliminated the only obstacle standing between him and his millions. He believed his father was a frail, confused, helpless old man, waiting to be shipped off to a psychiatric ward. He was devastatingly wrong. I slowly pushed myself up from the wooden floor, carefully retrieving the fallen tablet from the creeping shadows. The screen was still intact, the infrared footage streaming the inescapable evidence of their guilt. I wiped my face, feeling the cold mask of absolute vengeance settling permanently over my features. The blinding sorrow was completely gone. The pathetic time for playing the confused, frightened victim had officially passed. I had the clear, undeniable murder confession. I had the irrefutable, fully documented financial records. I had the absolute, undeniably perfect recorded truth. Tomorrow morning, the bright summer sun would finally rise over this treacherous house of lies. And when it eventually did, I would not just completely dismantle their stolen, blood-soaked empire. I would deliberately ensure that Matthew and Sarah burned in the very ashes of their own insurmountable greed, permanently locking them in a federal prison so remarkably dark and unforgiving that they would spend the entire rest of their miserable, pathetic lives begging on their hands and knees for the basic human mercy they had so brutally denied my beautiful Diane. I remained rooted to the spot, the sheer horror of Matthew's confession echoing relentlessly through the quiet room. The urge to scream, to tear the very walls of this house apart, clawed at my throat with a violent animalistic intensity. To stop myself from making a single sound, I brought my right hand to my mouth and bit down hard into the fleshy part of my palm. The sharp metallic taste of copper flooded my tongue as my teeth broke the fragile skin. The sudden burst of physical pain was entirely grounding. It anchored my spiraling mind back to the immediate reality of the dark bedroom. I squeezed my eyes shut, letting the physical sting override the agonizing shatter of my broken heart. My son had murdered my wife. The boy I had taught to ride a bicycle, the child I had proudly carried on my shoulders, was a calculating, cold-blooded killer. The final remnants of my paternal love withered and died in that exact moment, turning into dry ash within my hollow chest. I released my bitten hand, wiping the fresh blood on my dark trousers. I was no longer a grieving father, hoping to salvage some fragmented piece of his family. I was a structural engineer preparing to systematically demolish a condemned, irredeemable building. I was an executioner, and I desperately needed the absolute final piece of physical evidence to lock the trap permanently in place. Matthew had openly admitted to swapping Diane's heart medication with a lethal dose of beta blockers. If he was arrogant enough to leave the shredded financial documents in the garage trash bins, there was a high probability he had left the tampered pill bottle right where he originally placed it. I stood up, actively ignoring the dull ache in my weary knees, and moved silently toward the ensuite bathroom. I did not dare switch on the bright overhead lights. The harsh glow would easily bleed under the bedroom door and out into the dark hallway, instantly alerting anyone who might be awake. Instead, I heavily relied on the faint ambient moonlight filtering slowly through the frosted glass of the shower window. The bathroom still smelled faintly of Diane's signature lavender lotion. The deeply familiar scent temporarily threatened to break my rigid composure, but I ruthlessly pushed the useless emotion aside. I approached the mirrored medicine cabinet hanging securely above the cold porcelain sink. My pale reflection stared back at me in the dim light. I looked decades older, my face heavily carved with deep, harsh lines of ultimate betrayal and absolute resolve. I reached out with a perfectly steady hand and pulled the mirrored door open. The metallic hinges were well-oiled opening, with complete, absolute silence. I systematically scanned the neat rows of glass bottles, expensive cosmetics, and prescription tubes, strictly lining the thin glass shelves. There, sitting entirely innocently on the second shelf, was a small, amber-colored plastic prescription bottle. The crisp white label bore Diane's legal name printed clearly above the specific name of her prescribed mild heart medication. I carefully pulled a small, clear plastic evidence bag from my inner coat pocket. A brilliant precaution Melissa had sternly insisted I carry before leaving Vincent Caldwell's office yesterday afternoon. I quickly wrapped my left hand in a clean tissue to completely avoid contaminating the plastic surface with my own fingerprints, and I delicately lifted the amber bottle from the glass shelf. I held it up to the pale, filtering moonlight. The container was nearly full. I gently shook it, listening intensely to the soft rattle of the numerous pills inside. Matthew had deliberately crushed the lethal dose directly into her coffee cup, but he had obviously replaced her actual medication with the remaining heavy beta blockers to ensure the innocent illusion remained completely intact if anyone ever bothered to look closely. I slipped the plastic bottle securely into the clear evidence bag and sealed the top with a firm, decisive motion. This tiny plastic cylinder was the literal murder weapon. It was the undeniable physical proof that would perfectly corroborate his horrifying midnight confession. I tucked the sealed bag deep into my inner coat pocket, feeling its heavy weight press directly against my steadily beating heart. I carefully closed the mirrored cabinet door, perfectly restoring the bathroom to its pristine, undisturbed state. I walked back into the main bedroom and sat down heavily in my favorite leather armchair. The large grandfather clock downstairs chimed softly, signaling exactly 3 o'clock in the morning. I had 3 long hours left before the sun would finally rise over the quiet Chicago suburbs. I spent those remaining hours mentally rehearsing every single step of the impending brutal confrontation. I rigorously reviewed the complex sequence of the financial trap Melissa had expertly coded into my tablet. I analytically examined the precise phrasing I would utilize when I faced Matthew at the breakfast table. I aggressively needed him to feel completely secure, entirely victorious, right up until the exact second the steel jaws of the invisible trap snapped shut around his arrogant neck. I vividly visualized the sheer panic on his face when he finally realized his supposedly senile father had entirely outsmarted him. I brilliantly pictured Sarah's inevitable, hysterical panic when she ultimately understood her failing boutique was going to be aggressively seized by federal agents before noon. The sheer, unadulterated anticipation of their total financial and personal ruin fueled my physical endurance effortlessly, keeping me wide awake and fiercely alert through the absolute darkest hours of the lonely night. The severe storm outside finally began to break the heavy freezing rain, gradually tapering off into a gentle rhythmic drizzle against the thick window panes. The first faint streaks of morning dawn slowly began to paint the distant horizon in beautiful shades of bruised purple and cold, calculating gray. I stood up from the leather chair, meticulously smoothing the visible wrinkles from my dark clothes. I reached out and grabbed my wooden cane, gripping the curved wooden handle with absolute, unwavering certainty. The pathetic time for hiding in the terrified shadows was completely over. I walked over to the wooden bedroom door, placing my hand firmly on the brass doorknob. The grief that had paralyzed me was gone. I was fundamentally ready to end this nightmare. I turned the knob, stepping out into the hallway with the predatory grace of a man who held every single winning card. The floorboards did not creak beneath my feet. I moved with the silent, deadly precision of an absolute master architect overseeing a controlled demolition. I headed straight for the stairs, my mind entirely focused on the impending destruction of my treacherous son. The horrific murder of my beloved wife demanded an exceptionally brutal form of absolute justice, and I was deeply committed to delivering it personally. Every step I took toward the kitchen was a monumental step closer to their total annihilation. I would eagerly sign the incredibly fraudulent power of attorney document. I would smile warmly at them. And then I would systematically watch their lives completely burn. I would ensure they suffered for the rest of their miserable days on Earth. The morning light broke through the heavy storm clouds, casting a sharp, sterile glare across the polished hardwood floors of the hallway. I stood at the top of the stairs, gripping the curved handle of my wooden cane. I had showered, dressed in my dark morning suit, and meticulously prepared my features to reflect a broken, terrified old man. The titanium case and the amber prescription bottle were securely locked inside a hidden floor safe beneath my bed. The digital trap was fully operational, silently feeding every byte of data to Melissa. I just needed to secure Matthew's absolute commitment. I let out a loud, rattling cough, deliberately scuffing my shoes against the wooden steps as I began my agonizingly slow descent. The rich, dark scent of freshly brewed coffee drifted up from the kitchen. It was the same brand Diane had always loved. The absolute gall of my son to brew her favorite roast the morning after confessing to her murder ignited a fresh, searing wave of hatred in my chest. I suppressed it instantly, letting my shoulders slump and my hands tremble as I rounded the corner into the breakfast nook. Matthew and Sarah were already seated quietly. They were dressed impeccably looking, every bit the wealthy, successful couple they desperately pretended to be. The thick manila envelope rested squarely in the center of the kitchen table, an anchor of pure malice disguised as a legal formality. Matthew stood up the moment he saw me, his face stretched into a tight, incredibly forced smile. His eyes, however, were completely devoid of warmth. They were flat, cold, and utterly calculating. "Good morning, Dad," Matthew said, his voice entirely too loud and overly cheerful. "We made your coffee just the way you like it. Black, no sugar. Come sit down. We have a very busy day ahead of us with the funeral director." I shuffled toward the tall wooden stool, leaning heavily on the counter as I lowered myself down. I kept my gaze fixed firmly on the granite surface, refusing to meet his eyes. "I do not have much of an appetite, Matthew," I whispered, letting my voice waver with manufactured frailty. "My chest still feels terribly tight. I just want to rest. I want to go back to bed." Sarah slid a steaming ceramic mug toward my trembling hands. "You need to keep your physical strength completely up. William," she crooned, her tone dripping with false, venomous sympathy, "we are just trying to take all this heavy burden off your shoulders. You have been through a massive trauma. You are clearly not thinking straight." Matthew pulled the manila envelope closer, extracting a thick stack of stapled legal documents. He smoothed the crisp white pages flat against the stone counter, uncapping a heavy silver fountain pen and placing it deliberately beside the printed signature line. "Dad, we need to finalize this right now." Matthew stated, the cheerful facade already beginning to crack around the very edges of his face. "This is the general power of attorney we discussed yesterday. It gives me the legal authority to handle Mom's hospital bills, the mortuary fees, and the immediate estate transfers. I just need your signature right here at the bottom." I stared blankly at the silver pen, pulling my hands back into my lap, as if the metal instrument were burning hot. I shook my head slowly, letting a look of deep, profound confusion wash over my wrinkled face. "I cannot sign that, Matthew," I mumbled, stuttering slightly over the syllables. "I do not understand what all these dense paragraphs mean. Your mother always said I should never sign financial release forms without having Vincent Caldwell's legal team review them first. I need to call Vincent. I need to ask him." The mere mention of the billionaire's name acted like a spark to a massive powder keg. Matthew slammed his hand flat against the granite countertop, the sharp crack echoing violently through the silent kitchen. The coffee in my ceramic mug violently sloshed over the rim, burning my knuckles. I flinched, shrinking back into my chair, playing the terrified victim to absolute perfection. "You are not calling Vincent Caldwell," Matthew snarled, leaning across the island until his face was mere inches from mine. The mask of the grieving, supportive son completely evaporated, revealing the ruthless sociopathic predator lurking directly underneath. "I am done playing these pathetic, exhausting games with you, Dad. You are completely delusional. You are wandering around the house in the middle of the night, babbling about non-existent black ledgers. You are practically senile." I widened my eyes, letting out a small, pathetic gasp. "Matthew, please," I whimpered, raising a trembling hand to shield my face. "You are scaring me. Why are you yelling at me like this?" "I am yelling because you are a stubborn, useless old fool who refuses to accept reality," Matthew shouted, his face turning a dark, mottled shade of crimson. "Mom is dead. She is gone. And you are entirely incapable of managing a multi-million-dollar estate. You do not even know what day it is. If you do not pick up that pen and sign this document right now, I am going to make your life an absolute living nightmare." Sarah stepped up right beside him, crossing her arms tightly over her silk blouse. "You really should listen to your adult son, William," she added, her voice cold and completely merciless. "We have already spoken to a highly respected medical professional. We described your severe memory lapses, your crippling paranoia, and your sudden inability to care for your own basic needs." "What are you talking about?" I whispered, forcing a single tear to spill over my lower lash line. Matthew snatched the silver pen from the counter and thrust it violently into my trembling hand. "I am talking about a state-appointed guardianship, Dad." Matthew hissed, his words dripping with pure, unadulterated malice. "If you refuse to sign this voluntary legal proxy, I will go directly to a judge this afternoon. I will testify under oath that you have completely lost your mind due to severe traumatic grief. I will have you officially declared mentally incompetent before the sun sets." I stared at him, letting the sheer horror of his threat hang heavily in the tense, stagnant air. "You would not do that to your own father," I cried, my voice breaking perfectly. "You cannot put me away." "Watch me," Matthew threatened, his dark eyes locking onto mine with absolute, unwavering cruelty. "I will have you stripped of every single legal right you possess. I will have you physically dragged out of this house and locked away in a miserable state-run psychiatric nursing home. You will spend the rest of your pathetic life staring at a blank wall, sedated on heavy drugs, surrounded by strangers." Sarah leaned closer, smiling. "While you rot in a clinical cage, we will be living here enjoying everything you built. Do not force us to take the ugly route. Sign the paper. Get out of our way." They were actively blackmailing a vulnerable senior citizen. I looked down at the documents. The digital trap waited perfectly. I stared down at the crisp white pages resting on the cold granite countertop, letting my breathing become shallow and erratic. The threat of a state-run asylum hung in the polluted air, a cruel psychological weapon wielded relentlessly by my own blood. I forced my lower lip to quiver pathetically, allowing a series of ragged, broken sobs to tear their way up my throat. I squeezed my eyes shut, pushing hot, salty tears down my wrinkled cheeks. I let them see a fragile man shattered, a defeated father, whose spirit had been violently crushed under the heel of his son's cruelty. "Oh, Matthew," I wept, burying my wet face entirely in my visibly trembling hands. "Please do not do this to me. I cannot go to one of those terrible places. I will do whatever you want me to do. Just please let me stay safely in my own home. Let me stay exactly where my Diane lived." Matthew let out a heavy, incredibly dismissive sigh, his broad posture relaxing instantly into a relaxed stance of absolute arrogant victory. He slid the heavy silver fountain pen much closer to my rigid elbow. "Then stop making this so incredibly difficult, Dad," he said, his flat tone entirely devoid of any lingering human warmth. "Just sign the proxy documents. It is truly for your own good." I slowly lowered my shaking hands, wiping my tear-streaked face roughly with the dark cuff of my wool suit jacket. I reached out blindly for his silver pen, but deliberately let my clumsy fingers fumble intentionally, knocking the expensive metal off the smooth counter. It clattered sharply onto the hard tile floor, rolling swiftly away under the massive kitchen island out of my immediate reach. "I am so sorry," I mumbled, patting my left breast pocket with a frantic, completely disjointed, panicked rhythm. "My old hands are just shaking so very badly. I have my own pen. I always carry my own pen with me." I pulled a sleek, entirely unremarkable black ballpoint pen directly from my inner silk pocket. It looked completely ordinary, the exact kind of cheap, disposable office supply one might accidentally pick up at any local commercial bank branch. But it was absolutely not ordinary. Melissa had handed it to me yesterday afternoon with a cold, terrifyingly knowing smile. The specific ink contained inside the thin plastic cartridge was a highly specialized, intensely volatile chemical compound engineered strictly for covert espionage. Once applied physically to paper, the dense black liquid would stubbornly remain perfectly legible for exactly 2 uninterrupted hours. After that precise chronological window, it would completely vaporize, leaving absolutely no residue, no physical indention, and no trace behind whatsoever. The heavy legal pages would simply revert to perfectly blank, entirely unsigned pieces of worthless paper. I clicked the top of the specialized pen, bringing the sharp ballpoint down to the first signature line on the heavy stapled legal document. My hand shook violently, an Oscar-worthy physical performance of a terrified, incompetent elder permanently surrendering his absolute personal autonomy. I pressed the rolling tip to the thick paper and slowly, meticulously traced out my full legal name, William Thomas Marchand. The dark synthetic ink flowed smoothly, appearing solid and undeniably real to the completely untrained naked eye. I flipped carefully to the next page, executing another perfectly trembling, agonizingly slow signature. Matthew leaned menacingly over my right shoulder, his excited breathing incredibly shallow and exceptionally rapid. I could literally feel the disgusting heat of his unbridled greed radiating fiercely against my bare neck. He was a starving, desperate scavenger, eagerly watching a massive, unearned feast being laid out directly before him. Beside him, Sarah was practically vibrating with pure, unadulterated anticipation. Her wide eyes tracked every single stroke of my moving pen, completely mesmerized by the dark ink that she truly believed was the permanent legal key to her extraordinarily luxurious future. I dragged the agonizing process out, pausing intentionally to wipe fresh fake tears from my eyes, letting my right hand cramp and stall dramatically. I desperately wanted them to truly feel the agonizing suspense, to deeply savor the final fleeting moments of their perceived, absolute dominance. Finally, I reached the very last page. The Master Financial Authorization Clause. The definitive legal mechanism that would officially grant Matthew completely unrestricted immediate access to my entire personal financial portfolio, including the heavily fortified offshore accounts holding the stolen $8 million. I swallowed a loud fake sob, pressing the pen down firmly one last time, and signed my name. I let the black pen slip from my weak fingers, letting my heavy head hang low in utter, irredeemable defeat. "It is done," I whispered weakly, pushing the thick stack of signed papers across the smooth, cold granite surface. "You have absolutely everything now." Matthew did not offer a single word of comfort. He did not pat my shaking shoulder or even pretend to care about my manufactured emotional collapse. He lunged forward violently, his eager hands snatching the documents with terrifying predatory speed. He quickly flipped through the stiff pages, his dark eyes scanning each individual signature line to ensure I had not missed a single required initial. A massive, victorious, triumphant smile split his face, fully revealing a brief glimpse of the absolute monster I had clearly heard on the audio recording the long night before. "Perfect," Matthew declared arrogantly, tapping the heavy pages against the stone counter to perfectly align them. Sarah let out a sharp, breathless, euphoric laugh, reaching out to tightly squeeze his suited arm. "We need to leave right now, Matthew," she urged, her high voice tight with pure electric excitement. "The senior bank manager is expecting us exactly at 9 o'clock to swiftly finalize the immediate corporate estate transfers. We absolutely cannot be late." Matthew nodded, sliding the highly fraudulent power of attorney directly into his expensive leather briefcase. He turned to briefly look at me, his sharp expression suddenly entirely dismissive, actively treating me as if I were a useless piece of broken furniture taking up entirely unnecessary space in his modern kitchen. "Go upstairs and rest, Dad," he ordered coldly. "We will be gone for most of the long day, effectively handling the tedious legal logistics. Do not dare answer the front door and do not make any outgoing phone calls whatsoever. I will gladly handle absolutely everything from here on out." I did not bother to look up. I simply nodded my bowed head in silent, profoundly pathetic compliance. They turned their greedy backs on me without a single second thought. I listened intently to their hurried, chaotic footsteps moving briskly down the long hallway. The heavy front door opened wide and slammed shut aggressively. A moment later, the incredibly massive engine of Sarah's luxury SUV roared violently to life in the concrete driveway, its thick tires screeching slightly as they backed out recklessly and sped away toward downtown Chicago. They were aggressively racing toward the main bank branch, entirely consumed by the blinding, intoxicating promise of unearned millions. The sheer suffocating silence of the entirely empty house settled peacefully around me, like a thick, comforting woolen blanket. I sat perfectly still for 60 uninterrupted seconds, absolutely ensuring they were completely and undeniably gone. Then I slowly raised my heavy head. The pathetic, trembling frailty completely and instantly vanished from my upright posture. I straightened my tired spine aggressively, rolling my stiff shoulders back as the cold, exceptionally lethal clarity flooded my racing veins. I reached up quickly and wiped the final entirely fake tears from my perfectly dry cheeks. I looked directly across the massive kitchen, slowly raising my unyielding gaze to the high top of the wooden cabinetry where the hidden micro-camera rested invisibly in the dark shadows. I knew with absolute certainty that Melissa was actively watching the live video feed from her highly secure sub-basement server at Caldwell Investments. I offered the tiny invisible glass lens a sharp, incredibly grim nod of absolute unwavering readiness. The deadly bait had been successfully taken. The ravenous, bloodthirsty wolves had swallowed the deeply poisoned meat completely whole. In exactly 2 short hours, the dark synthetic ink on that legally binding document would completely vanish into thin air, leaving Matthew standing stupidly in front of a senior bank manager holding a stack of blank, utterly useless paper. But significantly more importantly, the exact second Matthew aggressively handed that document over and eagerly attempted to electronically access my highly fortified private accounts, his corrupted digital bridge would automatically connect directly into Melissa's patiently waiting surveillance servers. He truly thought he was walking into a bank to claim his stolen fortune. He was actually walking blindly straight into a devastating digital slaughterhouse. I sat perfectly still in the deafening silence of my kitchen, watching the heavy grandfather clock tick past the 2nd hour. The encrypted tablet resting on the granite counter suddenly chimed, breaking the quiet with a sharp metallic trill. I tapped the blinking notification icon. Melissa's sharp, professional voice immediately filled my earpiece. She informed me that Matthew had just arrived at the downtown branch of the International Bank. Furthermore, the brilliant digital trap had worked flawlessly. The exact moment Matthew connected his personal laptop to the bank's secure network to begin the authorization process, he had unknowingly granted Melissa unrestricted backdoor access to the internal security framework. She successfully hijacked the high-definition audiovisual feeds of the executive floor. The screen on my tablet fractured into a pristine real-time broadcast of the opulent VIP suite. I leaned forward, gripping the cold edges of the device, incredibly ready to witness the total, absolute destruction of my treacherous, murderous son. The video feed displayed a magnificent room paneled in rich, dark mahogany, featuring a massive, polished conference table and plush leather executive chairs. Matthew and Sarah were lounging at the center of the table, radiating an aura of staggering, unearned arrogance. Sarah had her legs elegantly crossed, admiring her diamond rings in the warm overhead lighting, while Matthew impatiently tapped his expensive luxury watch against the beautiful wood. They truly believed they were standing at the absolute pinnacle of the world, untouchable and forever victorious. A senior bank manager dressed in an immaculate charcoal suit scurried into the room, carrying a silver tray with premium coffee. He fawned over them, offering obsequious apologies for the slight delay. Matthew completely ignored the offered coffee, waving his hand with utter dismissiveness. He leaned back in his leather chair, adopting the cold, commanding posture of a billionaire tycoon. He aggressively demanded immediate, unrestricted access to the master portfolio, specifically instructing the manager to instantly initiate the final transfer protocols for the offshore Cayman accounts. His voice echoed through my earpiece, heavily dripping with a sickening blend of superiority and absolute entitlement. The senior bank manager nodded nervously, pulling a sleek silver laptop toward him. He calmly explained that a manual transfer of that staggering magnitude, specifically the stolen $8 million currently resting safely in the Caribbean Shell Corporation, absolutely required physical, notarized authorization from the primary account holder. Matthew let out a harsh, condescending laugh. He confidently reached into his designer leather briefcase and pulled out the thick manila envelope containing the power of attorney. He tossed it carelessly across the polished mahogany table. It slid to a smooth halt directly in front of the manager. Matthew proudly declared that he possessed full, absolute legal authority over his father's entire estate, claiming my mental faculties had severely declined and that he was now the sole financial guardian of the family legacy. Sarah smiled brightly, wrapping her hands lovingly around Matthew's arm in a disgusting display of unified greed. The manager politely adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and carefully opened the manila envelope. He slid the heavy stack of legal documents out, laying them flat under the bright halogen lights to precisely verify the necessary binding signatures. I watched the live broadcast with deeply bated breath, entirely fixated on the manager's face. He turned the first page, his thick brow furrowing slightly. He turned the second page, his frown instantly deepening into genuine, profound confusion. He rapidly flipped through the remaining sheets of paper, his eyes frantically scanning the bottom of every single page. The thick, dark, synthetic ink I had painstakingly applied just 2 hours ago had performed its highly specialized chemical function perfectly. The highly volatile compound had completely vaporized into the atmosphere, leaving absolutely zero trace, zero residue, and zero physical indentation on the crisp white paper. The designated signature lines were entirely, undeniably, and completely blank. The manager looked up at Matthew, a deeply bewildered expression washing completely over his professional features. He politely informed Matthew that there must be some sort of egregious mistake, as the highly critical document he had provided was completely unsigned. The supposed legal proxy was practically nothing but a thick stack of utterly worthless, completely empty pages. Matthew scoffed incredibly loudly, an ugly guttural sound of pure, unadulterated irritation. He aggressively lunged across the wide mahogany table and violently snatched the papers directly out of the manager's shaking hands. He viciously snapped that the manager must be completely blind, aggressively jabbing his stiff index finger toward the absolute bottom of the final page. But as Matthew looked deeply down, his arrogant, furious expression instantly and irrevocably shattered. The warm color completely drained from his entire face, instantly leaving him a sickly, terrifying shade of pale gray. His jaw dropped entirely open. He frantically flipped the thick pages over and over again, his sweating hands beginning to shake violently. The undeniable, staggering reality of the blank paper struck him with the devastating, crushing force of a physical blow. Sarah leaned heavily over his broad shoulder, her smooth brow knitting in sudden, sharp, electrifying panic. She shrilly demanded to know what was going horribly wrong, practically screaming while he was staring at empty paper. Matthew entirely ignored her, his heavy breathing turning remarkably ragged and shallow. He frantically grabbed his silver laptop, desperately trying to manually bypass the required physical authorization by aggressively accessing the digital bridge he had secretly built. But as his trembling fingers hit the keyboard, the screen flashed a brilliant, absolutely unforgiving crimson. Melissa had flawlessly executed her brilliant end of the devastating snare. Through my hidden earpiece, I clearly heard the rapid, piercing, synthetic trill of digital alarms echoing wildly from Matthew's completely compromised machine. He stared in absolute, unadulterated horror as a large, bold, black warning banner aggressively locked his glowing screen. Access denied. Federal investigation initiated. Assets completely frozen. Matthew began violently slamming his clenched fists against the smooth keyboard, screaming maniacally at the utterly bewildered bank manager to fix the server immediately. He wildly accused the terrified manager of playing treacherous, illegal games, his once confident voice completely unhinged, cracking pathetically under the immense, crushing weight of his rapidly collapsing reality. Sarah stumbled violently backward, tightly covering her open mouth with heavily trembling hands as the truly horrific realization finally dawned on her completely. Their stolen $8 million, their incredibly luxurious future, and their previously perceived absolute dominance were completely and permanently evaporating right before their terrified eyes. The grand illusion of their total victory had aggressively crumbled into absolute irredeemable dust, entirely leaving them naked and terribly exposed in the cold, extremely harsh light of their undeniable, thoroughly documented financial crimes. Matthew stood up abruptly, his expensive leather chair crashing violently backward. He wildly grabbed the completely blank papers, aggressively preparing to launch a physical tirade against the terrified manager. But before he could even utter another furious syllable, the heavy mahogany doors of the VIP suite were violently kicked open. The wood slammed brutally against the interior wall with a deafening crack. A tactical team of heavily armed federal agents immediately flooded the opulent room, instantly surrounding the large conference table, barking uncompromising orders. The heavily armed federal agents moved with terrifying synchronized precision. They instantly formed an impenetrable perimeter around the massive mahogany conference table, their dark tactical gear contrasting sharply against the opulent cream-colored walls of the banking suite. The terrified bank manager practically threw himself against the far wall, raising his trembling hands in immediate surrender. Matthew and Sarah remained entirely frozen in their luxurious leather chairs, their mouths hanging open in sheer, unadulterated shock. The grand illusion of their brilliant criminal masterpiece was violently shattering into a million jagged pieces right in front of their widened eyes. Before Matthew could even attempt to form a coherent syllable of protest, the federal agents stepped slightly aside, creating a clear pathway through the wide doorway. Vincent Caldwell walked into the room first. The billionaire radiated an aura of absolute, uncompromising authority, his sharp features carved into a mask of pure, vindictive fury. Melissa followed closely behind him, her face completely stoic, as she moved directly toward the compromised silver laptop resting on the table. And then I walked through the door. I did not shuffle. I did not lean on my wooden cane. I left the carved piece of wood resting against the doorframe outside, stepping into the bright VIP suite, with my spine perfectly straight and my head held incredibly high. The pathetic, trembling frailty I had meticulously performed all morning completely vanished. I looked directly at my son, my gaze carrying the cold, crushing weight of absolute vengeance. Matthew stared at me, his frantic mind completely unable to process the profound physical transformation standing before him. "Dad," he stammered, his voice weak and entirely stripped of its former arrogance. "Dad, what is happening? These agents just burst in. Tell them there is a massive mistake. We were just filing the estate paperwork." "There is absolutely no mistake, Matthew," I replied, my voice echoing through the quiet, tense room with crystal-clear resonance. The only mistake was assuming I was a clueless, senile old man who would blindly hand over the keys to his entire existence. The ink in that pen was a highly volatile synthetic compound. The signatures vanished precisely as they were intended to. The instant you tried to bridge your laptop into this secure banking mainframe, you triggered a federal alarm that Melissa engineered specifically for you. Melissa did not even look up from the keyboard as she swiftly secured the digital perimeter. The $8 million located in your Cayman Islands Shell Corporation has been completely frozen and actively rerouted back to the Caldwell Investments primary reserves, she stated coldly. Your corrupted digital footprint has been entirely documented. Sarah let out a high, terrified whine, desperately clutching the edge of the polished mahogany table as her legs completely gave out beneath her. Matthew shook his head wildly, his face slick with cold sweat as he desperately tried to construct a new, plausible lie. "This is a massive misunderstanding," he pleaded, his voice rising in desperate pitch. "Vincent, please listen to me. Diane wanted me to manage these funds. She authorized the transfer. My father is just confused by grief. He does not understand the complexities of corporate finance." I stepped forward, entirely ignoring his pathetic, flailing attempts to save himself. I reached into the inner pocket of my dark morning suit and pulled out a small, heavy digital playback device. I placed it deliberately in the exact center of the massive conference table, the dark metal clinking sharply against the polished wood. Your mother understood absolutely everything I said, my voice dropping into a deadly, uncompromising calm. She understood your limitless greed. She understood you were stealing millions. She drafted a massive revision to her will to cut you out entirely and leave the Montana estate to a pediatric hospital. She was going to expose you, Matthew, and we all know exactly how you decided to handle that threat. I pressed the small play button on the device. The pristine, high-definition audio filled the cavernous banking suite with absolutely terrifying clarity. Matthew's own voice echoed off the opulent walls, capturing his midnight conversation with Sarah in the dark kitchen. "I handled it. The recorded voice of my son snapped viciously. I swapped her heart medication with a lethal dose of beta blockers. I crushed the pills, dissolved them in her coffee, and watched her drink every drop. The coroner ruled it a completely natural heart attack because she had a documented history of minor cardiac arrhythmia. There was absolutely no reason to run a toxicology screen. We are in the clear. The absolute silence that followed the recording was profoundly suffocating. The bank manager let out a horrified, muffled gasp, sliding down the wall in pure shock. Vincent Caldwell closed his eyes, his jaw clenching with intense, righteous anger. The federal agents instantly tightened their formidable grips on their weapons, their eyes locking onto Matthew with deep, unmasked disgust. Matthew stood completely paralyzed. The remaining color drained entirely from his face, leaving him a ghastly, translucent shade of white. His lips moved soundlessly, utterly incapable of forming a single word of defense against the devastating, undeniable truth of his own recorded confession. The bulletproof trap had officially snapped shut, crushing him completely. Sarah was the first to physically break. She let out a piercing, blood-curdling scream, violently pushing her chair away from the table. She scrambled wildly backward, pressing herself against the far wall, as if Matthew were suddenly covered in literal flames. "I had absolutely nothing to do with that," she shrieked hysterically, pointing a shaking manicured finger directly at her husband. "He did it. He killed her. He poisoned the coffee. I did not know he was going to murder his own mother. He forced me to keep quiet. You have to believe me, I am completely innocent." Matthew slowly turned his head to look at the woman he had committed murder to satisfy. The profound, agonizing realization of her absolute betrayal washed over his pale face. The woman who had encouraged his greed, who had callously celebrated Diane's death just hours prior, was eagerly throwing him to the federal wolves to save her own pathetic skin. They were completely turning on each other, entirely consumed by the very same selfishness that had driven them to steal and kill. The lead federal agent stepped forward, his heavy boots echoing sharply on the floor. "Matthew Marchand, you are under arrest for grand larceny, massive corporate wire fraud, and the premeditated murder of Diane Marchand," the agent stated firmly, his voice cutting through Sarah's hysterical sobbing. "Sarah Marchand, you are under arrest as an accessory to murder and a primary co-conspirator in federal financial fraud. You have the right to remain completely silent." Two agents moved swiftly, grabbing Matthew by the shoulders and forcefully turning him around. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs locking securely around his wrists sounded like absolute music to my weary ears. Two other agents aggressively restrained Sarah, ignoring her frantic, useless pleas as they secured her hands tightly behind her back. Matthew did not struggle against the federal agents. He was completely broken, a hollow shell of the arrogant predator who had strutted into this bank just minutes ago. As the agents violently pulled him toward the heavy mahogany doors, he stopped and looked back over his shoulder. His dark eyes met mine, swimming with the pathetic, desperate plea for a father's mercy that no longer existed. "Dad." Matthew whispered, his voice trembling, with sheer unadulterated terror. "Please." I looked at my son one last time, feeling the absolute frigid iron resolve permanently fortifying my shattered heart. "You are no longer my son," I said, my voice entirely steady and completely merciless. "You are nothing but the monster who murdered my wife, and you will spend the rest of your miserable life burning in the ashes of your own greed." I turned my back to him, facing the large panoramic window overlooking the sprawling Chicago skyline. I listened to his pathetic sobs fading away down the long corridor as the agents aggressively dragged him and his treacherous wife out of the building and completely out of my life forever. Justice had been served cold, and the air finally felt clear enough to breathe. I spent my entire life building a foundation of trust, believing that blood meant loyalty. But true evil does not always break through your front door with a weapon. Sometimes it sits at your dinner table smiling, waiting for you to close your eyes. I lost the woman I loved, to the boy we raised, but I refused to let her memory be buried in lies. Greed is a poison that rots the soul from the inside out. Always trust your instincts, because the most dangerous predators are the ones who convince you that you are entirely safe. If this story opened your eyes, hit the like button and subscribe so you never miss another truth. Have you ever discovered a dark secret hidden by someone you loved and trusted? I am reading all your comments below. Share your story and let us expose the truth together.